On Christmas Eve, when Evergreen Falls went silent, the snow covered more than roads and rooftops. It covered secrets. At the far end of a forgotten street, an old homeless man and his German shepherd found something the storm was meant to erase. A police officer left to die. What happened next would reopen a buried truth, change 3 lives, and remind a town what courage really looks like. This is not a story about heroes with medals. It is a story about staying when walking away feels safer. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from tonight and leave a comment below. And if stories of hope, loyalty, and quiet miracles matter to you, please press subscribe to support the channel and stay with us for this journey. Snow came early to Evergreen Falls, Montana, the way a stern old god arrives without knocking, taking the town's sharp corners and rounding them into silence. On Christmas Eve, the sky stayed the color of pewter, and the wind threaded through the streets like it was searching for a name to call. Drifts leaned against storefront windows on Main Street, softening the outlines of parked trucks and turning the sidewalks into pale dunes. Evergreen Falls wasn't a big place. One long spine of road, a handful of churches, a diner that smelled like bacon and old stories, a hardware store that sold everything from nails to gossip, and at the far end of it all, a bus station that had closed years ago but still held its rusted awning like a tired hat. In weather like this, even sound seemed to shiver. The town didn't feel asleep. It felt as if it was holding its breath. Under that bus station awning sat Samuel Crowley, 71, on a wooden crate stained dark by years of moisture and grime. Samuel was the kind of man who looked carved by patience and bad luck. Tall once, now slightly stooped, shoulders narrow under a threadbare wool coat that hung on him like it belonged to someone else. His face was long and weather-worn, with a gray beard trimmed short, not out of style, but out of practicality. The skin around his eyes was mapped with fine lines, the kind that came from squinting into sun, snow, and bills he could no longer pay. His hands were big, knuckled, and cracked, hands that had once solved problems with wrenches and steady pressure. Now they wrapped around a chipped thermos, as if warmth could be summoned by stubbornness alone. The thermos was mostly a prop. The liquid inside had surrendered to the cold an hour ago. Samuel still held it the way a man holds onto the last familiar thing he owns. He hadn't always been here. Once, Samuel had owned a garage 2 towns over, a place with bright fluorescent lights, a concrete floor stained with honest work, and a sign out front that read, Crowley Auto Repair, in letters that had started bold and ended faded. He had been good at it, good enough that people trusted him with their cars and sometimes with their secrets. He used to laugh more too, and his laughter came easier when Lila was alive. Lila Crowley, his wife, had been a loud-laughing woman with sharp opinions and the kind of warmth that filled a room before she even spoke. She had been short and sturdy, hair always pinned up with a clip she swore she'd replace one of these days, and she had loved Christmas like it was a personal mission from heaven. It wasn't a single tragedy that broke Samuel's life. It was the slow stacking of losses. Lila's illness, the medical bills, the garage closing after he missed too many days, the landlord who stopped accepting promises, pride that kept him from calling the few friends he had left. In the end, Samuel had drifted into Evergreen Falls the way a leaf drifts into a gutter. No dramatic moment, just gravity and time. Next to him lay Ash, a male German shepherd with a dark sable coat that looked almost black in the low light, streaked with brown like smoke trapped in fur. Ash was about 7 years old, full-grown and powerfully built, but his strength carried the wear of seasons. His paws were scarred and rough, the pads thickened by ice and salt. One ear had a small notch near the tip, as if life had taken a bite and decided it didn't want the rest. His eyes were amber brown and steady, eyes that didn't plead, they assessed. Ash had the kind of calm that came from surviving. Not soft, not cruel, simply focused. He wasn't the sort of dog that bounced or begged. When he moved, it was with a quiet certainty, like a soldier who no longer wasted energy on unnecessary steps. They hadn't chosen each other in some storybook way. 5 winters ago, Ash had appeared behind the old bus station, ribs showing under his coat, limping slightly, eyes watchful. Samuel had shared half a stale sandwich without saying a word, and Ash had stayed. That was it. No name exchange, no dramatic rescue, just two beings recognizing a simple truth. Staying alive alone was harder than staying alive together. Samuel had named him Ash because the dog's coat reminded him of fire's aftermath. Dark, stubborn, and somehow still warm if you got close enough. Ash didn't respond to whistles much, but he responded to Samuel's voice, low and steady, and to the small rituals they did. Samuel's hand on his neck before sleep, Ash's body pressed near Samuel's legs when the wind got mean. The evening deepened. Christmas lights blinked on storefronts, cheerful in a way that almost felt rude. Somewhere up the street, a radio played a carol, muffled by snow and distance, like a memory trying to remember itself correctly. Samuel watched people pass in a hurry, families bundled in bright coats, couples carrying paper bags from the bakery, a teenager in a Santa hat walking too fast to pretend he wasn't cold. Most didn't look Samuel's way. A few did, then immediately looked elsewhere, as if eye contact might become an obligation. Samuel wasn't angry about it anymore. Anger took fuel, and he lived on too little to waste. Still, he felt the old ache in his chest each time someone's gaze slid away. It wasn't just hunger or cold. It was the sensation of becoming invisible. He used to be a man with a name spoken in the diner, a man with keys and a schedule and a place where people expected him to show up. Now he was a shape under an awning, just another piece of winter scenery. Ash lifted his head, ears twitching. Samuel didn't notice at first. He was busy staring at the street, thinking about Lila's Christmas mornings. The way she used to make him taste the gravy and then swat his hand away with the spoon, laughing as if the world could never break them. He was thinking about how the word miracle sounded different when you had less to lose, either like hope or like a joke. Then Ash rose, not slowly, not lazily, instantly, as if a string had been pulled inside him. His ears snapped forward, his tail held still, low but not tucked. The muscles along his shoulders tightened, turning his silhouette into something poised and ready. Ash's nose worked the air with quick, deliberate breaths. It wasn't the scent of food. It wasn't the familiar passing of townspeople or the deer that sometimes slipped close to the edge of town. This was something sharper, something wrong, the kind of scent that carried fear and metal and urgency. Samuel felt the change before he understood it. Ash wasn't a dramatic dog. When Ash moved like this, it meant the world had shifted. "What is it, boy?" Samuel murmured, voice rasping from cold. He tried for humor because humor was easier than dread. "You smell Santa? Because I'm not sharing cookies with a guy who breaks into houses." Ash didn't glance back. He stepped forward, pulling gently at the frayed leash Samuel kept looped around his wrist. Not a yank, not a panic, just a firm insistence. Ash's gaze locked toward the narrow service alley behind the hardware store, an alley Samuel avoided because it collected wind like a funnel and garbage like a magnet. In daylight, it was uninviting. In snow, it became a corridor of shadow. Samuel hesitated. His body was tired in the way only long years could create, bone-deep fatigue that made every choice feel expensive. And yet he'd learned something on the streets. When a dog with this kind of instinct said move, you moved. Dogs weren't fooled by Christmas lights or polite faces. "All right," Samuel said, pushing himself up. His knees protested, and he exhaled slowly, as if bargaining with his own joints. He adjusted his coat, tucked the thermos into his bag like it mattered, and followed. Ash led him off Main Street, into the side path where snow drifted higher. The wind sharpened between buildings, scraping at Samuel's cheeks. The alley narrowed, brick walls on either side, the hardware store's back door half buried in a drift. The world smelled different here, colder, dirtier, less human. Ash moved with purpose, paws sinking and rising with a quiet crunch. Samuel's heart started to thud harder, not from exertion, from a familiar fear. Trouble. Trouble didn't come to men like him with gentle hands. Trouble came with blame. Ash stopped. His head lowered, ears still forward, body angled like a shield without being told. Samuel followed Ash's gaze and saw it, a shape against the brick wall, half buried in fresh snowfall. At first it looked like a discarded coat. Then it shifted slightly. Or maybe the wind shifted the snow. Samuel's breath caught. A man lay there. The man's jacket was a police jacket, dark fabric stiff with ice, torn at the shoulder. His hands were bound behind his back with zip ties pulled tight enough to cut into skin. Blood had frozen along his temple, dark streaks crusted against pale flesh. His face was partly obscured by snow, but the shape of his jaw and the faint rise and fall of his chest told Samuel he was still alive. Barely. Near the man's chest, a badge glinted faintly, catching the thin light like a small, stubborn star. Samuel's stomach turned. His mind moved fast, not with clarity but with survival. A homeless man found over a beaten officer. No one would ask for explanations first. They would draw conclusions. They would decide the story before hearing it. Ash stepped closer, then lowered himself carefully against the officer's chest, pressing his warmth into the man's body the way animals did when instinct overruled fear. Ash's posture was steady and protective, not aggressive, as if he was guarding a fragile flame from wind. He let out a low breath, and fog rose from his muzzle like a quiet prayer. Samuel's throat tightened until swallowing hurt. The officer's breath was faint, uneven. Frost clung to the man's eyelashes. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted him hurt. They wanted him erased, covered by snow until morning made him just another winter accident. Samuel stood there, trembling, not only from cold, but from the weight of what he was seeing. This wasn't a random beating. This was deliberate. This was a message written in bruises and silence. And in the middle of it, Ash, his Ash, was acting like something older than hunger and shelter had taken over him. Like a guardian from some myth, stubborn enough to stand in winter's throat and say, "Not this one. Not tonight." Samuel's fingers tightened around the leash. His eyes flicked toward the mouth of the alley, toward the invisible watchers his mind insisted might exist. He could almost feel the town's judgments gathering in the snow, waiting. He looked down at Ash and tried again for humor, but his voice came out small. "You always pick the easy jobs, don't you?" he whispered, the words turning to mist in the air. Ash didn't move. His paw rested lightly on the officer's chest, as if counting the next breath. Samuel stared at the badge, the torn jacket, the zip ties, the blood turned black by cold. The storm hissed between the buildings. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang again, muted, uncertain. And Samuel realized the town might be quiet, but the snow remembered everything. He took one slow step closer, eyes fixed on the man's face, and the chapter ended on that knife edge of choice. Samuel Crowley standing over a fallen officer on Christmas Eve with only a scarred German shepherd beside him, and the storm pressing in like a judge. Snow pressed deeper into the alley, filling the spaces between moments, between thoughts, between the breaths of the man lying at Samuel Crowley's feet. The wind threaded itself through the narrow corridor behind the hardware store, carrying with it the smell of iron and cold brick and something else. Fear, sharp and unmistakable. Samuel stood frozen, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew too well what this moment could cost him. He was 71 years old, homeless, invisible when it suited the world, and suddenly standing over a nearly dead police officer on Christmas Eve. The snow did not care about innocence or intent. Neither, Samuel knew, did people. The man on the ground was younger than Samuel by decades, his face still carrying the structure of strength even in collapse. His dark hair was matted with ice, lashes clumped together with frost, lips pale and faintly blue. He had the build of someone used to moving with authority, broad shoulders, solid frame, even now betrayed by the way his body lay twisted against the brick wall. The zip ties around his wrists were bright white, clean, industrial. Whoever had bound him had come prepared. This was not rage. This was planning. Samuel had seen rage on the streets, drunken fists, panicked shoves, anger that burned hot and brief. This was different. This was a message carved slowly, deliberately, into flesh and weather. Ash pressed closer to the man, his flank firm against the officer's chest, the heat of his body a stubborn defiance against the cold. Snow dusted Ash's back and melted just enough to darken his fur before freezing again. His breath rose and fell in steady clouds, measured, controlled. He was not frantic. He was not afraid. Ash's posture was that of a guardian who had already decided his place in the story. One scarred paw rested lightly against the officer's coat. Not pressing, not testing, just there, a point of connection, as if reminding the man's heart to keep going. Ash's amber eyes stayed fixed on the mouth of the alley, watching for movement, for danger, for anything that might dare approach. Samuel's chest tightened. He had never seen Ash like this, not even when food was stolen from them, not when a group of teenagers had thrown rocks for sport, not when another dog had tried to claim their space. This was older than hunger, older than fear. This was instinct sharpened into duty. "Easy," Samuel whispered, though he wasn't sure who the word was for. His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the wind. He crouched slightly, knees protesting, and leaned closer to the fallen man without touching him. The cold radiated upward, seeping into Samuel's bones as if it recognized a familiar host. He could see now that the officer's jacket had been ripped open at the shoulder, the fabric torn with intent, not accident. There were bruises along the man's jawline, swelling already set, and the faint metallic scent of blood clung to the air like a warning bell. Samuel's mind worked fast, flipping through memories and calculations the way it always had when survival was on the line. He knew what happened to men like him when something went wrong nearby. He knew how stories were shaped before facts were known. A homeless man, a dead or dying cop, no witnesses, snow that erased footprints and softened timelines. It would be easy, too easy, to decide Samuel Crowley was part of the problem. He imagined hands on his shoulders, rough and unquestioning. Imagined the cold steel of cuffs biting into wrists that had already given enough to winter. Imagined Ash barking, confused, dragged away, or worse, left behind. The thought made his stomach turn. Ash shifted slightly, angling his body more fully between Samuel and the open end of the alley, as if sensing the direction of Samuel's fear. The dog's ears flicked, catching distant sounds, the muffled hum of a passing truck, the faint echo of laughter from somewhere far up Main Street, a radio playing a carol just loud enough to remind the world that celebration was happening elsewhere. None of it mattered here. In this narrow space, time had slowed, thickened, like sap in the cold. Samuel studied Ash, really studied him, and for a moment the fear loosened its grip. Ash was not a young dog anymore. His muzzle was dusted with gray, his movements economical, practiced. There was intelligence in the set of his eyes, the way he scanned the alley in deliberate sweeps. Samuel had often wondered about Ash's life before him. Dogs like this disciplined, this steady, did not come from nowhere. Ash carried himself like a creature who had once been trained, perhaps worked, perhaps been trusted with more than survival. Samuel had never asked. The past was heavy enough without borrowing someone else's. The officer groaned faintly, a sound so quiet Samuel almost missed it. Ash responded immediately, lowering his head and pressing closer, his breath warming the man's collar. The sound broke something open in Samuel's chest. This man was alive. Fragile, but alive. And as long as he was alive, there was still a choice to be made. Samuel looked down at the zip ties again, the way they bit into swollen skin, the rawness already forming around them. He felt anger flicker, surprising and unwelcome. Anger took energy, but sometimes it also brought clarity. Whoever had done this had wanted the cold to finish the job. They had counted on the storm, on the holiday, on the quiet. They had counted on people like Samuel to look away, to keep moving, to choose survival over interference. Samuel had lived most of the past few years doing exactly that, choosing survival, choosing not to be seen. He had learned when to step aside, when to stay silent, when to disappear into the background. It had kept him alive. But as he stood there, snow gathering on his shoulders, he felt the weight of a different memory pressing in. 6 winters ago, before Ash, before Evergreen Falls, Samuel had collapsed on a sidewalk outside a grocery store. His legs had given out without warning, exhaustion and hunger finally calling in their debt. He remembered the concrete biting through his coat, the way the cold seemed to crawl inside him and settle. People had stepped around him, careful not to trip. One woman had paused, concern flickering across her face like a match struck in wind. Then she had checked her watch and walked on. Samuel didn't blame her. Everyone was late for something, but he remembered the sound of her boots moving away more than he remembered the pain. The memory settled now, heavy and familiar. Samuel exhaled slowly, breath fogging thick in the air. "You always pick the worst timing," he murmured to Ash, attempting humor again, though it trembled at the edges. Couldn't it be a lost glove? A dropped sandwich? Ash did not look back. His focus never wavered. Samuel straightened a little, spine aching, and scanned the alley again. Snow continued to fall, steady and relentless, erasing the world 1 inch at a time. The brick walls loomed close, their red surfaces darkened by moisture and age. A flickering security light buzzed weakly above the hardware store's back door, casting uneven shadows that shifted with the wind. Samuel felt exposed and hidden all at once, caught between the desire to vanish and the knowledge that vanishing now would cost someone else their life. He knelt with care, ignoring the protest in his joints, and leaned closer to the officer's face. "Hey," he said softly, not sure if the man could hear. "Stay with us. Just stay." His voice carried no authority, no promise of rescue, only the simple insistence of someone who knew what it meant to be left behind. The officer's breath hitched again, shallow but present. Snowflakes landed on his cheek and melted, leaving faint tracks that looked like tears. Samuel's hands curled into fists inside his gloves. He understood the shape of this moment now. This was not just a test of courage. This was a test of identity. The world had taught Samuel to survive by staying small, by avoiding attention, by accepting the margins. But here, in this alley, with Ash's body shielding a stranger from death, survival demanded something else. It demanded visibility. It demanded risk. The storm pressed closer, wind whispering through the alley like a crowd leaning in. Somewhere beyond the buildings, Evergreen Falls continued its Christmas Eve, doors closing, ovens warming, candles being lit. The town did not know what lay behind the hardware store, did not know that a man's life balanced on the stubborn warmth of a dog and the conscience of another forgotten soul. Samuel looked once more at the badge, the faint glint of metal beneath ice, and felt the weight of choice settle fully into his bones. This was not a mugging. This was not an accident. This was something meant to be buried. Ash lifted his head slightly and met Samuel's eyes for the briefest moment. There was no question in that gaze, only resolve. Samuel nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if answering a vow he had not known he was making. The snow kept falling. And in the quiet heart of Evergreen Falls, beneath the weight of winter and consequence, Samuel Crowley stood over a fallen officer and understood that whatever came next, there would be no going back. The instinct came first. It rose in Samuel Crowley like a reflex he had spent years perfecting, older than logic, faster than conscience. Leave, move, disappear. The alley was wrong, the body was wrong, the timing was lethal. Every lesson the streets had taught him shouted the same command: survival belongs to those who are not remembered. A homeless man standing over a beaten police officer on Christmas Eve was not a misunderstanding waiting to be clarified. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. Samuel took a single step backward, boots crunching softly in the snow. His breath quickened, fogging thick in front of his face. He did not look away from the officer, not yet. But his body had already begun to retreat, the way animals did when they sensed a trap closing. He imagined blue lights flaring at the mouth of the alley. Imagined voices barking orders. Imagined hands reaching not to help but to restrain. He imagined Ash confused, snarling, punished for loyalty. The images stacked fast and merciless. Ash reacted instantly. The dog shifted his weight, pressing more firmly against the officer's chest, angling his broad back toward the open end of the alley so that the wind, and any threat, would strike him first. Snow slid from his shoulders as he settled, resolute. One scarred paw lifted and rested gently against the man's coat, right over the place where a heart fought to keep rhythm. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if Ash were anchoring the officer to the world by touch alone. Samuel froze. He had seen fear before, in men, in animals, in himself. This was not fear. This was refusal. The officer's breath rasped faintly, shallow and uneven. Frost clung stubbornly to his lashes. Ash's muzzle hovered near the man's collar, each exhale a gift of warmth stolen from his own body. The dog did not look at Samuel. He did not need to. His choice had already been made. The wind cut sharper through the alley, driving needles of cold into Samuel's cheeks. He felt suddenly, acutely old. His knees ached, his hands trembled, his back protested the slightest shift of weight. He was tired in a way rest no longer fixed. Tired of calculating exits. Tired of weighing risk against hunger. Tired of living like every day was a negotiation with disaster. He closed his eyes for a moment, and memory rushed in uninvited. 6 winters earlier, Samuel had collapsed on a sidewalk just as dusk fell. The sky had been that same flat gray, the kind that erased shadows. He remembered the shock of the ground, the way his breath had left him in a startled wheeze. He remembered lying there, staring at boots, black leather, brown suede, polished, scuffed, passing by like a parade of indifference. One woman had slowed. He could still see her face, the crease of concern between her brows. She had looked at him, really looked, and for a heartbeat Samuel had believed help was coming. Then her phone rang. She glanced at it, hesitated, and kept walking. He remembered the cold most of all. How it crept in gently at first, then settled deep, convincing him that staying still was easier than fighting. Samuel opened his eyes. Ash had not moved. "All right," Samuel whispered, the word breaking slightly as it left his mouth. It was not a surrender, it was a promise. "I won't." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin but steady, like ice that hadn't cracked yet. He swallowed, forcing breath back into his lungs, and looked around the alley one last time. The brick walls loomed close, stained dark with years of weather. The flickering security light buzzed overhead, its weak glow barely touching the edges of the scene. Snow continued to fall, patient and thorough, eager to bury evidence and intent alike. Samuel's mind raced, shifting from fear to function. He could not untie the zip ties. His fingers were numb, and the risk of worsening the man's injuries was too great. He could not drag the officer. The man was heavier than he looked, and movement might kill him. He could not stay here and wait. The cold would win long before anyone stumbled upon them by chance. There was only one thing he could do: the emergency call box. Samuel glanced toward Main Street, toward the brick wall 3 buildings down, where the red metal box was bolted like an accusation. He had passed it countless times, had never used it. It was loud, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Pulling it would summon help and attention. It would also summon questions. Names. Faces. Samuel looked down at Ash again. The dog's amber eyes finally flicked up, meeting Samuel's gaze. There was no fear there, only expectation. Trust. Samuel let out a breath that trembled despite his efforts. "Stay," he murmured. The word carried weight now. Instruction. Plea. "Don't move." Ash responded not with obedience but with certainty. He lowered his head again, pressing closer to the officer, body firm and unmoving. His tail lay still against the snow, his ears angled forward, listening to the world Samuel was about to re-enter. Samuel straightened, every joint protesting. He took a step away from the pair, then another, each movement feeling like he was tearing himself from an anchor. The cold hit harder as he left the shelter of Ash's presence. Wind sliced through the alley, clawing at his coat, urging him back into safety or anonymity. He ignored it. His boot slipped once, then found purchase. His heart hammered in his chest, loud enough that he was sure Ash could hear it. With every step toward Main Street, the noise of the town crept back in, muted laughter, the hum of an engine, the distant echo of music. Evergreen Falls was alive out there, busy with warmth and celebration, unaware of the thin line Samuel was crossing. He broke into a run. It was not graceful. His breath burned, his legs complained, his vision blurred at the edges. Snow stung his face, melting against his skin and freezing again. He passed darkened storefronts and glowing windows, past a couple hurrying toward the diner with their heads bent together, past a truck idling at the curb. No one paid him much attention. He was just another bundled figure moving too fast for comfort. The red emergency call box loomed ahead, bolted to the brick wall like a challenge. Its paint was chipped, faded by years of weather and neglect. Samuel slowed as he approached, heart pounding, lungs aching. For a fraction of a second, his hand hovered inches from the handle. This was the point of no return. Once he pulled it, there would be noise. Sirens. Flashing lights. Questions. He would be seen. Remembered. Whatever story followed would include him whether he liked it or not. Samuel thought of Lila then, not as she had been at the end, thin and tired, but as she had been in their early years, hands on her hips, eyes bright, laughing at him when he hesitated over small choices. "You always think too long," she used to say. "By the time you decide, life's already moved on." Samuel closed his fingers around the handle. He pulled. The alarm tore through the evening, violent and unforgiving, slicing through the hush of snowfall and carols alike. The sound echoed down Main Street, bounced off brick and glass, demanded attention from every corner of Evergreen Falls. Samuel flinched as it rang out, his ears ringing, his heart racing. He did not wait to see who noticed. He turned and ran back toward the alley, legs screaming, breath ragged, hope and fear tangling in his chest. Snow swallowed his footprints almost as soon as he made them. The world felt suddenly too loud, too fast, as if he had woken something ancient and impatient. When Samuel reached the alley again, he slowed, dread coiling tight. He scanned the shadows, his eyes locking immediately onto the shape by the wall. Ash had not moved. Snow coated the dog's back more heavily now, turning his dark fur white in patches. His breath still fogged the air, steady and determined. He remained pressed against the officer, paw in place, body shielding, as if the alarm had never sounded, as if the only thing that mattered was the fragile life beneath him. Samuel sagged with relief he hadn't realized he was holding. He leaned against the brick wall, chest heaving, and slid down until he was crouched again near Ash and the officer. His hand hovered for a moment, then settled gently on Ash's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth beneath the cold. "Good," Samuel whispered, voice hoarse. "Good boy." Ash did not look up. In the distance, faint at first, then growing clearer, Samuel heard it, the sound of engines cutting through snow, of urgency waking the town. The choice had been made. The cost would come later. For now, Ash stayed, and help was coming. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a sound that felt final, even though nothing was finished yet. Snow streaked sideways across the hospital parking lot, catching in the harsh white glare of floodlights. Evergreen Falls Regional Medical Center was a squat concrete building perched at the edge of town, built for function rather than comfort, its windows glowing like tired eyes in the storm. Inside, heaters groaned under the strain, and the air smelled of disinfectant and overheated plastic. Christmas decorations hung along the hallway, paper wreaths taped to doors, a string of blinking lights drooping from the nurse's station, attempts at cheer that felt almost apologetic in a place designed for pain. Officer Daniel Mercer arrived unconscious. He was 42 years old, though the cold had added years to his face, draining color and softness alike. His body was stiff with hypothermia, his skin pale beneath the smears of dried blood. The zip ties were cut away quickly, red marks blooming angrily around his wrists as circulation returned. Nurses moved with efficient urgency, voices low but precise, hands practiced and unflinching. Hypothermia. Internal bruising. Possible concussion. The words stacked like weights, heavy but not yet final. Doctors would later say that 15 more minutes in the alley would have ended the story completely. Samuel Crowley did not follow the gurney past the emergency doors. He stopped short, instinctively, as if there were an invisible line he was not allowed to cross. He stood there, snow melting into dark patches on his coat, hands trembling with cold and aftermath. He had given his name to a uniformed officer who asked for it, voice polite but unreadable. No one cuffed him, no one pushed him away. Still, he felt exposed, flayed by light and attention. Ash, no, Ranger, though Samuel did not know that yet, sat just outside the emergency room doors. The dog lowered himself to the tiled floor with care, folding long legs beneath his body, positioning himself where he could see both the doors and the hallway beyond. His dark sable coat was still dusted with melting snow, droplets gathering beneath him and spreading across the floor like a shadow. He ignored the stares, the murmured comments, the hesitant attempts by staff to coax him away. There was something in his posture that discouraged interference. Not aggression, but certainty. He was not waiting out of confusion. He was standing watch. Hours passed. The hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm. The soft beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles against linoleum, the distant cough of someone who had been awake too long. Outside, the storm continued its slow siege, piling snow against doors and windows, pressing the world inward. Christmas Eve slid quietly toward morning. Samuel sat on a hard plastic chair along the wall, coat still on, hands clasped together between his knees. He did not sleep. Every so often, a nurse would glance his way, curiosity flickering, but no one asked him to leave. Perhaps it was the dog. Perhaps it was the holiday. Or perhaps people were simply too tired to push kindness away. Ash did not move. He lifted his head occasionally, ears twitching at sounds only he could interpret. His breathing was steady now. No longer the harsh exhale of cold exposure, but the controlled rhythm of vigilance. His eyes never strayed far from the emergency room doors. Near dawn, when the sky outside shifted from black to a washed-out gray, movement finally stirred behind the glass. Daniel Mercer woke slowly. Consciousness returned to him in fragments. Pain first, then confusion. His head throbbed dully, a deep ache that pulsed behind his eyes. His limbs felt heavy, distant, as if they belonged to someone else. The air smelled wrong, too clean, too sharp. Not snow, not brick. He tried to move and failed, a soft groan escaping before he could stop it. A nurse leaned over him, voice calm, practiced. "Easy, you're safe. You're in the hospital." Safe? The word took time to settle. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. White ceiling tiles. Harsh lights. The faint reflection of his own face in a monitor screen. Older than he expected, lined with exhaustion he thought he had hidden better. He turned his head slightly, wincing as pain flared. And that was when he saw the dog. The dog sat just beyond the threshold of the room, visible through the open door, dark against the pale hallway. Big. Still. Watching. Something in Daniel's chest tightened. "Ranger," he whispered. The name scraped out of him, raw and instinctive, as if it had been waiting beneath his tongue for years. Ash froze. It was not the stiffening of fear or surprise, but the precise stillness of recognition. His ears lifted, angling forward, his body tensing in a way that spoke of memory rather than threat. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet and stepped closer to the doorway. Eyes never leaving Daniel's face. The room seemed to hold its breath. Samuel, dozing upright in his chair, startled awake at the sound. He blinked, disoriented, then followed Daniel's gaze to Ash. He saw something shift in the dog's expression. Not in any obvious, human way, but in the subtle alignment of posture and focus. The name had landed somewhere deep. "Ranger?" Daniel whispered again, voice cracking now, disbelief threading through pain. His eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with something close. Recognition without explanation. A doctor stepped in, brows furrowed. "You know that dog?" Daniel swallowed, throat tight. "He was mine." The truth did not come all at once. It emerged slowly over the next 2 days, as Daniel's strength returned in uneven increments, as memory stitched itself back together. Daniel Mercer had once been a K-9 handler, respected, meticulous, known for his patience and quiet competence. Ranger had been his partner then, trained, disciplined, fiercely loyal. Together they had worked cases that required precision and trust. Warehouse inspections, narcotic searches, evidence sweeps after fires. It was a warehouse fire that broke everything. The blaze had been ruled accidental, faulty wiring, old building, bad luck. But Daniel had known better. Ranger had alerted on something buried beneath the debris. Metal, oil, something wrong. Guns. Evidence that never made it into the final report. Names that appeared in his notes and then vanished from official records. When Daniel pushed, when he asked questions that made people uncomfortable, he was transferred. Quietly. Sidelined under the guise of departmental restructuring. Ranger disappeared in the chaos. Officially, the dog was listed as lost during the fire response, presumed dead or taken by the blaze. Daniel had searched anyway. For weeks, then months. He never found him. The case went cold. So did Daniel's career. The alley attack had not been random. It had been calculated. Someone had decided silence was no longer enough. Samuel listened to pieces of this story as it surfaced, told in low voices by nurses, by officers who came and went with careful expressions. He remained on the edges, a quiet presence with no uniform and no place in the official narrative. No one asked him to leave. No one invited him closer either. He did not mind. Watching was enough. Ash, Ranger, never left Daniel's side for long. When allowed, he lay near the bed, head resting on his paws, eyes tracking every shift of breath, every change in posture. When he was ushered back into the hallway, he waited without complaint. His vigilance was not anxious now. It was settled, purposeful, as if a long, unfinished sentence had finally found its ending. Samuel watched them together and felt a strange, unfamiliar ache bloom in his chest. This dog had carried a history larger than the streets, larger than hunger and cold. He had walked away from one life and into another without ceremony, without recognition, until now. Names, Samuel realized, mattered. They anchored you to the world. Without them, you drifted. Near the end of the second day, as winter light filtered weakly through hospital windows, Daniel slept again, his breathing steadier, less labored. Ash lay nearby, chin on the floor, eyes half-lidded but alert. Samuel sat in his chair, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Someone had pressed into his hands without comment. Outside, the storm finally began to loosen its grip. The snow had tried to bury the truth. It had failed. 3 nights after the hospital grew quieter and the storm finally loosened its grip, Ranger reacted again. It was not the sudden, sharp alert Samuel had learned to recognize in moments of danger. There was no explosive bark, no frantic pull at the leash. Instead, the change came like a switch thrown deep inside the dog. Quiet, decisive, unmistakable. Ranger rose from the thin blanket laid out for him near the hospital's side entrance, stretched once, and stood facing the dark road beyond the parking lot, head lifted, nostrils flaring. The air was colder than it had been, the kind of cold that sharpened scent and memory alike. Snow creaked beneath boots and tires, packed down by days of passing. The night carried a different weight now, less chaos, more intention. Samuel noticed immediately. He had learned Ranger's rhythms quickly in these past days, how the dog slept lightly, how he woke at the smallest disturbance, how he seemed to measure the world before moving through it. Samuel was bundled against the cold, hands shoved into pockets that still smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. He was tired, but it was a new kind of tired, the sort that followed doing the right thing and waiting for consequences to catch up. "What is it, boy?" Samuel murmured, keeping his voice low. Ranger did not look back. He took a single step forward, then another, stopping only to glance briefly over his shoulder, not asking permission, simply checking that Samuel was still there. The look carried expectation rather than urgency. "Follow." Samuel hesitated. He glanced toward the hospital doors, where Daniel Mercer slept under blankets and machines, his breathing finally even. Officers came and went now, quieter than before, eyes sharper, conversations clipped and careful. The town knew something had happened, even if it didn't yet know what. Samuel felt again the familiar prickle of being out of place, of standing at the edge of a story that might not want him. Ranger took another step, patience thinning. "All right," Samuel said, exhaling. "I'm coming." They moved away from the hospital lights and onto the road that skirted the edge of Evergreen Falls, snowbanks rising like walls on either side. The town fell away behind them, its muted glow swallowed by trees in distance. Pines stood dark and tall, their branches sagging under the weight of snow. The sky hung low, a blanket of cloud that reflected no stars. The night felt older out here, untouched by decoration or apology. Ranger walked with purpose, his gait steady and economical. He followed the road for a short distance, then veered off toward a barely visible service track, half buried and rarely used. Samuel struggled to keep up, boots slipping occasionally on ice hidden beneath fresh powder. His breath burned in his chest, lungs protesting the cold. He wondered fleetingly what he would say if someone stopped him. If a cruiser's lights cut through the trees and demanded explanations he was not sure he could give. But no one came. The track led them deeper into the outskirts, past a chain-link fence bent and rusted with age, past a sagging sign half buried in snow. The letters were faded but still legible. Northern Cold Storage. The facility squatted in the clearing beyond, a low, rectangular building with corrugated metal walls, windows boarded over long ago. Snow drifted high against its sides, smoothing its edges, trying to make it disappear into the landscape. Ranger stopped. His head lowered, ears angling forward, body taut but controlled. He circled once, nose skimming the snow, then returned to the same spot, pawing lightly at the ground. The scent was strongest here. Samuel stared at the building, unease crawling up his spine. It looked abandoned, forgotten, the kind of place towns pretended no longer existed. He had passed it before in warmer months, had never thought twice. Now, under snow and darkness, it felt like a secret that had waited patiently to be found. "You're sure?" Samuel said softly, more statement than question. Ranger let out a low breath through his nose, a sound that might have been agreement. Samuel did not go closer. He had learned enough in his life to know when to stop. Instead, he turned back the way they had come, heart pounding harder now, urgency threading through fatigue. He knew where to find help. He knew who needed to see this. By the time officers arrived, 3 vehicles crunching through snow, lights cutting sharp blue and red through the trees, Ranger was back at the edge of the clearing, posture unchanged. The men and women who stepped out moved carefully, hands near belts, eyes scanning the building and its surroundings. Their faces were tight with focus, the easy confidence of routine replaced by something more deliberate. "This is the place," Samuel said quietly when asked, his voice steady despite the cold biting at his bones. "He led me here." One of the officers glanced at Ranger, then back at the building. "Your dog?" Samuel shook his head. "Not really." They moved in pairs, checking the perimeter, radios murmuring clipped phrases. A padlock on the side door yielded quickly, brittle with rust. Inside, the air hit them like a held breath released. Cold, stale, tinged with oil and metal. Their flashlights cut narrow paths through darkness, beams catching on stacked crates and dust-coated machinery. The facility's refrigeration units stood silent, hulking shapes that had not hummed in years. Ranger entered last, slipping past Samuel and the officers with quiet confidence. His nose dropped immediately, tracing lines across the concrete floor, pausing at doorways, circling specific crates with unmistakable focus. This was not curiosity. This was confirmation. They found the weapons first. Crates stacked too high at the back of the facility, their contents carefully wrapped, labeled with codes that meant nothing to Samuel but drew sharp reactions from the officers. Rifles, handguns, ammunition sealed against moisture. Enough to supply more than a few bad decisions. Enough to matter. They found the records next, ledgers tucked into a metal cabinet, pages yellowed but intact, names and dates written with bureaucratic neatness. Boxes of documents stored behind false walls, evidence tags long expired. Trails that led backward in time, past the warehouse fire, past the missing reports, past the quiet transfers and the vanished questions. Ranger moved among it all without excitement, as if the work itself mattered more than the discovery. He paused occasionally, glancing toward Samuel, then back to the officers, his role complete. He had brought them to what the snow had tried to hide. The investigation did not explode into headlines. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like ice cracking beneath careful steps. Officers came and went from the facility over the following days, cataloging, photographing, tracing. Conversations grew quieter in the halls of the station. Names were spoken with caution. Phones rang behind closed doors. The town felt different, less asleep, more watchful. Samuel watched from the margins again, his place familiar and strange all at once. No one pushed him away. A few nodded when they passed. Someone handed him a cup of coffee without comment. Ranger stayed close, his presence grounding, his eyes still sharp but no longer searching. Daniel Mercer, still recovering, was told pieces of what had been found. He listened without triumph, without anger. Just a slow, steady exhale, as if a weight he had carried alone had finally shifted. The snow continued to fall on Evergreen Falls, lighter now, less insistent. It dusted the cold storage facility again, softening its harsh lines, trying one last time to make it disappear. But it was too late. The ground remembered. The air remembered. Ranger remembered. And what had been buried no longer belonged to winter. Samuel Crowley's new room was small. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the warmth, not the clean lines, not the silence that didn't ache. Just the size. It reminded him of spaces he used to pass through without thinking. An office at the garage, a spare room at his sister's house before pride had burned that bridge, the narrow cab of a tow truck where he once drank coffee and watched snow fall through a windshield that belonged to him. The room was simple. A single bed with a thick blanket folded neatly at the foot. A wooden dresser with one drawer that stuck slightly when pulled. A narrow desk beneath a window that looked out over a parking lot dusted in fresh snow. A radiator hissed softly beneath the sill, releasing steady, forgiving heat. Everything smelled faintly of pine cleaner and something older. Fresh paint, perhaps. Or time finally paused long enough to settle. Samuel stood just inside the doorway, coat still on, boots still laced, one hand gripping the strap of his worn canvas bag. He did not move. Years of transience had trained his body to expect the next instruction, the next eviction, the next reason to keep walking. A room like this felt provisional, like a kindness that might change its mind. Ranger padded in behind him. The dog paused at the threshold, assessing. His dark sable coat caught the light differently here, no longer dulled by alley shadows or hospital glare. The scars on his paws were still visible, reminders that did not fade with comfort. He stepped forward, nails clicking softly against the floor, and circled the room once with deliberate care. Nose low, tail relaxed, ears flicking at the radiator's hiss and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Satisfied, he crossed to the heater and lowered himself onto the floor, stretching out with a long, contented exhale that sounded almost like relief. Samuel watched him, something in his chest loosening at the sound. The first night, Samuel sat on the edge of the bed fully dressed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the door. He waited for the familiar urge, the tightening in his gut, the itch beneath his skin that told him staying too long was dangerous. He waited for the voices of habit to rise up and warn him that this was borrowed time, that people change their minds, that warmth always came with conditions. The urge never came. Outside, snow fell softly, no longer sharp or demanding. It drifted down in slow, patient flakes, covering the world without trying to erase it. The town moved quietly, as if aware that something fragile was settling into place. In the days that followed, things happened without ceremony. Daniel Mercer was reinstated. There was no press conference, no public apology, no attempt to dress the moment in grandeur. The paperwork arrived quietly, signatures appearing where they had been withheld for years. A meeting was held behind closed doors. A few people cleared their desks early. A resignation came before a warrant had to. The truth did not shout. It simply stood long enough to be acknowledged. Daniel accepted it the same way he had endured its absence, without flourish. He was still thinner than he should have been, his movements careful as his body continued to heal. The bruises along his jaw faded from purple to yellow, then disappeared altogether. The lines around his eyes remained, etched by years of vigilance and disappointment. He wore plain clothes now more often than uniform, as if easing himself back into the shape of duty rather than stepping fully into it. Ranger received his designation next, an honorary K-9 assignment. No return to active duty, no expectations beyond what he had already given. His service was named, recorded, and recognized in a brief ceremony attended by a handful of officers and staff who understood the weight of quiet loyalty. Ranger sat through it without fuss, posture relaxed, eyes alert but calm. When a badge was presented, he did not react. He had never needed symbols to know who he was. Samuel stood at the edge of that small gathering, hands clasped, coat brushed clean for once. He did not know where he belonged in moments like this. He had learned how to survive invisibility, not recognition. When someone pressed a key into his palm afterward, he almost dropped it. "Temporary," the woman said, voice gentle but firm. She was middle-aged, hair streaked with gray, eyes kind in the way that came from having learned when not to look away. "As long as you need. No rush." The key was cool and solid, heavier than it had any right to be. Samuel closed his fingers around it slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. That evening, Daniel stopped by the room. He brought bread from the bakery, a round loaf with a cracked crust and the faint scent of rosemary, and a paper bag that rustled when he shifted it. He did not knock loudly. He waited, as if giving Samuel the chance to decide whether to answer. Samuel did. They sat at the small desk together, bread torn and shared, butter melting into the warm crumb. Conversation came easily and awkwardly all at once. They spoke of small things at first, the weather finally easing, the diner reopening after the storm, the way Evergreen Falls always seemed to recover slowly, like someone stiff from cold. Eventually, silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just unforced. "Thank you," Daniel said finally, eyes on Ranger, who lay near the heater, chin resting on his paws. The words were simple, insufficient, honest. "I don't think I ever said it properly." Samuel shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "He's the one you should thank." Ranger lifted his head briefly at the sound of his name, then settled again. Later, as evening deepened, church bells rang across town. They were clearer now, less muffled, as if the snow had decided to listen instead of interfere. The church doors stood open, light spilling out onto the steps. It was not an announcement, not an invitation extended with pressure. Just open doors, warmth visible from the street. Samuel watched from the window for a long moment. He did not feel obligated. He did not feel unworthy. He simply felt allowed. He went. Inside, the church smelled of pine boughs and old wood. Candles flickered along the aisle, casting soft shadows that danced without urgency. The pews were not full. Evergreen Falls did not pretend to be larger than it was. People nodded when Samuel entered, recognition mixed with something new, respect, perhaps, or relief. No one asked him to explain himself. No one asked him to move. Ranger lay at his feet during the service, head resting against Samuel's boot. When the pastor spoke, her voice was steady and unadorned. She did not speak of angels descending or thunder-splitting skies. She spoke of staying, of the small, stubborn acts that changed the direction of lives without ever making headlines, of how miracles rarely announced themselves, how they often arrived quietly, with scarred paws and tired hands, and the simple refusal to look away. Samuel felt the words settle somewhere deep. Snow fell outside, soft and steady, blanketing Evergreen Falls in a clean hush. It did not feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a benediction. That night, back in the small room, Samuel undressed slowly and climbed into bed. The sheets were crisp, cool at first, then warming quickly beneath his weight. Ranger shifted closer to the heater, then turned and crossed the room, settling beside the bed with a sigh that carried no tension at all. Samuel lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of a place meant to be lived in. For the first time in many winters, he did not feel the need to stay alert. He did not rehearse exits or excuses. He let his eyes close. Christmas had come back to him. Not as spectacle, not as reward, but as something simpler and harder to earn. A place, a name, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes staying was the bravest thing a person could do. At the end of this story, the miracle was not thunder from the sky or angels appearing in light. The miracle was simple, and that is how God often works. God works through the ones who stay, through a tired old man who could have walked away, through a loyal dog who chose to protect instead of flee, through hearts that refused to look away even when fear said leave. In our daily lives, we wait for big signs from God. But most miracles come quietly. They come when we choose compassion over comfort, truth over silence, love over fear. If you are watching this tonight, know this: God sees you even in your coldest season. He remembers you even when the world forgets. And sometimes He uses ordinary people and small choices to bring extraordinary grace. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and write Amen. If you believe that God still works miracles in quiet ways, and please support our channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and redemption. May God bless you, your family, and everyone watching tonight. Amen.